Well, hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Joe Barnhart. I want to welcome you. And if you do or don't believe in God, you are welcome to participate with us. Right here in East Tennessee, you can find free thinkers and agnostics and others. This is committed, this program, to people who have a scientific approach without supernatural beliefs.
Today's topic is the Apostle Paul and forgiveness.
And go ahead.
But first we want to tell viewers about the sponsors of the show, I guess.
Oh, good.
All right. The Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meetup at a bar or eatery. Tonight's meetup is at Barley's in the Old City, starting at around 5:30. Look for the silver-jacketed copy of The God Delusion standing upright on the table. And as Matt Dillahunty at Atheist Experience says, everyone is welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't.
Okay. Then the Rationalists of East Tennessee have several meetings, and the first and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures or presentations with a lively roundtable discussion. The second Sunday is the Skeptics Book Club. On the fourth Sunday, we're mixing it up. Sometimes we get together for just a reflection meeting, potluck, and sometimes we play board games and watch a movie and have a good time together.
Oh, and this Saturday we're actually getting together and we're going to do an Adopt a Highway pickup. Mm-hmm. Well, later in the show we'll give you our websites to visit for additional details, including times and locations. Well, Joe, we got a little bit of in the news. Can you tell us what was in the news?
Okay, the governor of Tennessee vetoed the bill to make the Bible the state book of Tennessee. A simple majority of the legislators in each body will be sufficient to override this vote, however.
All righty. So we wonder if the questions we and others raised about all the fighting over which version of the Holy Bible is correct was persuasive at all. The LA Times reports that the governor wrote in part, "If we recognize the Bible as a sacred text, then we're violating the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Tennessee by designating it as an official book." Haslam wrote, "Our founders recognized that when the church and state were combined, it was the church that suffered in the long run."
Yeah, he's right.
So his legal reasoning is spot on. Mm-hmm. And so that gives him the legal cover to do what he did. You know, I think that, pointing out that if you can't even agree on a correct version or a uniform version of a holy book, that makes it even more problematic to then tie the government up in with that, what amounts to that disagreement.
Well, they would, even if they say, well, it doesn't matter which translation, you still have differences.
Yeah.
If you're going to try to do it in the schools.
And in fact, yes, because it what it does is it turns every person who's an employee of the state who might, let's take it upon themselves to buy a copy of the state's book for a school or a state library, that they're acting as a procurement officer and they're choosing which version.
Yeah,
they have no choice
but
to choose a version. Yeah. Well, they can buy multiple copies each time they're choosing a version.
They could let each student bring its own copy.
Well, but the whole point is that once you declare it's the state book, then you turn into this thing of, well, does the state buy the state book and provide it anywhere? Do they provide it at the welcome centers on the interstate highway?
Remember, too, for the Hebrew tradition, it's not the New Testament.
Yeah, and in fact, there were proposed amendments to clarify that, to make sure it included the Torah as well, and that amendment was not accepted. So what does that mean? Does that mean, well, that means the Hebrew part is not part of the state book. It's only the Christian version. So it's a can of worms.
Yeah, it is. It is. That's why the founding fathers said stay out of it.
So the governor was right to do so. He was on good constitutional grounds, and maybe we could even say good theological grounds to do so. All righty. Well, so today's topic, and if we can get the title changed, is the Apostle Paul. If we could get the title slide changed,
It's
Sam, if we could get the title slide changed, is the Apostle Paul and forgiveness.
And he has a good. Did Paul improve on the law? That's another good way.
There we go. So, Joe, you proposed the topic for today's show, and I thought, well, it may not be obvious who we're talking about. And I said, the first question we ought to begin with is, what do we mean? Who is the Apostle Paul?
Well, he was not one of the 12 disciples, and as a matter of fact, there is no evidence that he knew the historical Jesus at all. There just isn't any evidence that he did. And in fact, when you have Peter and James on the one hand and Paul seemingly in strong argument, Paul nowhere quotes any texts about the historical Jesus to prove his case. You would think that would be imperative to do.
All right.
But he doesn't.
I guess I would make the argument that he didn't know Jesus because when you read Acts, you learn that Paul
Came later.
has a vision of Jesus. Well, what does he need a vision for to lend legitimacy to his faith or arguments if he had actually met Jesus?
Yeah.
And what's more is he talks about how he had been persecuting Christians.
Yeah, he says in Galatians that he did not get his gospel from any man. I mean, he's making it clear he did not consult the disciples about this, that he got it as, from his point of view, a direct revelation. Now, I want to try to approach him and this controversy among the disciples as an anthropologist would.
We got a little section here that I borrowed from Wikipedia.
Go.
And I guess I think this helps a little bit. It says, Paul the Apostle, originally known as Saul of Tarsus, did I get that word right?
Yeah.
All right. Was an apostle, although not one of the 12 apostles, who taught the gospel of Christ to the first century world. He's generally considered one of the most important figures of the apostolic age. We're going to have to come back and I'm going to have to ask you what the apostolic age means. In the mid-30s to the mid-50s, he founded several churches in Asia Minor and Europe. Paul took advantage of his stature as both a Jew and a Roman citizen to minister to both Jewish and Roman audiences. So if you're non-Jewish, what's the word for that?
Well, there's Gentiles.
Gentile, all right. And so that gets used in the Bible. According to the writings of the New Testament, Paul, who was originally called Saul, Wikipedia repeats themselves there, was dedicated to the persecution of the early disciples of Jesus in the area of Jerusalem. In the narrative of the book of Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, often simply referred to as Acts, while Paul was traveling on the road from Jerusalem to Damascus on a mission to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem. The resurrected Jesus appeared to him in a great light, and he was struck blind, but after 3 days his sight was restored by, I may mangle this name as well, Ananias of Damascus. And Paul began to preach that Jesus of Nazareth is the Jewish Messiah and the Son of God. Approximately half of the book of Acts deals with Paul's life and works. So I notice it says Jesus of Nazareth, not Bethlehem.
Well, it's like county, and I mean, it's, you could be from Knox County and Knoxville or something, you know.
All right.
Now, the important thing, some scholars think that the book of Acts, written by the guy who wrote the Gospel of Luke, did not have access to Paul's letters and his epistles, and that he's not overly reliable, particularly in the 8th chapter and the 22nd chapter of Acts, who's reporting all this conversion.
Okay.
And that so the better way to study Paul is his own letters.
Okay.
And see what he has to say, and that's about all you have there in the New Testament.
So let's talk about the timeline. I've heard it asserted that Paul's writings are earlier, are the earliest, and they're earlier than the Gospels.
Yeah,
that's why the Gospel of Luke, you're implying it comes later, but he actually didn't have access to
Well,
Paul's
if he did,
letters?
it doesn't seem that his writings have any reflection of Paul's letters.
Of the letters,
Yeah.
okay.
And if you want to learn about Paul, just read his own letters. I mean, you get the first reports. And
So is there speculation of the motive of the writer of Luke and Acts, why he would write about Paul, even though he didn't have his
You had
his
a big
letters?
controversy between Paul and on the one hand and Peter and James on the
right.
other. And most scholars say that the gospel, that the book of Acts is simply trying to smooth over this big
Okay, they're
controversy.
papering over a disagreement, and so therefore they include both sides, so to speak.
Well, they tried
sort of
and
have to.
and they come up with a third side almost, but
All right.
smoothing over. It's not a very good report in some ways, they claim.
So I guess I said I was going to ask you about this apostolic age, and
Well, that's usually considered from about, say 40 or 35 on to the end of the century.
the end of the century,
Yeah.
because by then all the apostles would have died,
Now,
no
John,
longer alive.
the Gospel of John, we don't know really who wrote this. Most scholars think it may have been written partly in the 2nd century. Some parts of it, it's not clear, but it's pretty late. It's the last of the 4 Gospels. Mark was not one of the. We don't really know who wrote Mark, Matthew, and Mark and Luke. We just know that later on names were put onto these books. And some think that the Gospel of Mark came first, which is around 70 A.D., and it was written probably in Rome, mostly trying to inform the Gentiles about who this Jesus was from Israel and Jerusalem and Galilee, and that was part of the job of. And then Matthew and Luke, whoever they are, borrowed from the Gospel of Mark and then contributed their own.
Or borrowed from the same source. I've heard something referred to as Q. That might.
Well, no,
the
that'd
common source.
be something else too.
Am I thinking Old Testament there, or am I conflating?
No.
two things?
That's it's just a German word for source,
Yes.
and it's just simply saying that Mark had sources, and there are other sources that maybe Matthew and Luke had in common, and then Mark had. Matthew had other sources, and Luke had other sources too.
Okay.
Many sources.
All right. I'm afraid I may have drug us off topic.
Well, let's get to Paul. Paul is. Some say he invented Christianity. I think that's going too far, but he certainly made a major, major impact on this movement. And I think that what's important to understand about Paul is since he had no direct acquaintance with the historical Jesus, and he did seem to have strong disagreements with James, presumably Jesus' brother, and Peter, and some of those others who came up to Antioch and have a controversy with
Who
him.
are presumed to have known the Jesus.
And Paul makes it clear that he knew Jesus by direct revelation. Now he's putting himself in the tradition of the old Hebrew prophets. You see, they get direct.
They get a message from God.
Yeah, now that's before text messages, but it's sort of the same thing. And
Right into the brain.
yeah, I went straight. Well, Paul, because he went to the third heaven, and he's quite serious. Now, what's important from an anthropologist's point of view rather than a missionary's point of view is an anthropologist says, let's study another culture just to see what it means to them. Let's don't make judgments. We have judgments, but to study it, find out what it means to them and what problems they were solving. And I like that approach because it gives you an angle to say two things about Paul. One, he did believe that he got divine revelations, you see. Now, my interpretation is he didn't, but I want to try to understand his point of view, what he's doing. And I think if I mix my view and his together, that he had insights to, in other words, what I'm trying to say is what an anthropologist would say. What kind of problems was he trying to solve in that local situation? And one of the big problems was he's in a Hebrew tradition with circumcision, dietary laws, and other things, but he's also trying to bring this monotheism to a Gentile world. And
because he eventually traveled into the Greek and Roman world as well, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he traveled a lot. And so in doing that, he's going to have to modify some of his tradition. That's what when you have cross-cultural.
He is tailoring the product to its market,
Exactly.
the market that he's encountering.
And he's doing it by taking from the Hebrew tradition what he thinks is the best, and namely, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's in the Deuteronomy and Leviticus. That's part of the Hebrew. Now, James, in the Epistle to James, that's in his epistle.
All righty.
And in Paul's stresses, and that's what seemingly they have in common.
Mm-hmm. So they're trying to craft something that's a little different than the fire and brimstone God of the Old Testament that was smiting towns and drowning the world.
Well, don't forget
and working on punishment rather than, in a sense, suggesting get along with your neighbor.
Get along with your neighbor is in the Hebrew Bible itself, the Old Testament.
Mm-hmm.
You see, so in other words, you can't just say that.
Well, it is not as emphasized.
Well, you can put it this way: what you have is amity-enmity complex, love of insiders and hostility to outsiders. Almost all cultures tend to develop this. And what you have the reason I'm interested in Paul is here you have cultures coming together, and so you've got to somehow overcome some of this and amity-enmity.
And because he was now a citizen of what at that time
Roman
was the world's largest empire.
Exactly.
And there was intercourse of ideas all around the Mediterranean and out into Western Asia.
Now, in the Hebrew tradition that he grew up in, and a lot of Hebrews understood this themselves before Paul. I mean, you could take the prophet Micah. In some ways, was maybe a century or two or more ahead of Paul. You just don't get it as developed. But Paul is trying to say you obviously cannot have Greek and Roman men being circumcised when they're grown. I mean, so
that product doesn't sell.
It doesn't sell, and so he's simply finding a way simply to recognize it as a little more than a tribal mark, like a tattoo to recognize you're in this tribe rather than that tribe.
Now, the circumcision enters the Bible in, I guess it's Exodus.
Exodus 4, yeah.
Where, I guess it's not explained real well, but the Hebrew God decides one day, maybe he's going to kill Moses. And Moses' wife acts to appease the God by circumcising their son.
Yeah, in other words, it says, here's some flesh and blood. That's what you want. And that's and uses, we had mentioned this on the program once before, using a
sharp
stone.
Yes.
Yeah, and that's the Stone Age.
So this is an echo of a Stone Age literary tradition.
Yeah, and it probably is older, in my opinion, it's older than the Hebrew tradition. You have some evidence for it in Africa, and it probably had maybe some health reasons too, they think.
Well, it's interesting. I know that archaeologists talk about the Iron Age, and before that they talk about the Bronze Age, and before that they talk about, they'll use the phrase Late Stone Age, or Neolithic, meaning new Stone Age is in the most recent, Neolithic. And I think they place that date, that transition from Neolithic to Bronze Age, right about the time when writing begins. That's around 5,000 years ago.
Yeah.
And so if there were things that were written by the Sumerians, for instance, that reflected these traditions, they would have been they'd have been mere centuries separating the Neolithic from the early Bronze Age.
So,
and they wrote a flood story as well. So, you know, things like that were being...
Well, the stories get
written
told,
down.
and then they get retold and retold. Put it in a new context. We do it today.
Yes.
And, and that's understandable. Now, so one of the things about the Apostle Paul is an anthropologist would say he's a problem solver. He's trying to say, how are we going to get in our new community, which they're called Christians now, and how are we going to get the Hebrews and the Romans and the Greeks all together in this new community? Well, that means there are going to have to be some compromises. And Moses was the one presumably brought the law.
All right, had those 2 stone tablets.
Yeah, now, one of the problems is if you get too many laws and they deal with...
Well, that's right. We had all the rest of Leviticus show up as well. All right. So,
then you got a massive, and that's a burden to any culture.
and they weren't merely, laws like, don't kill people. It was things like don't wear fabrics with mixed fiber.
Mixed fiber, yeah.
Which seems like a kind of a strange micromanagement when they didn't bother to get around to say things like, don't rape and own slaves.
Well, slavery was probably implicit in the Golden Rule. They just ignored it. And the Golden Rule is pretty deep in the culture, the Hebrew culture. And but it was made too much ethnocentric, just
Yes.
our group.
It was don't own Hebrew slaves.
Yeah, that was the problem. And all cultures tend to have done this.
Yeah.
And it's by coming in contact with each other.
Our nation is contaminated with that same evil.
All cultures do that. And it's by having to do business and transactions with other cultures that you learned modifications,
Yeah.
not only of your practices, but your belief system sometimes changes when you encounter other viewpoints. And what's interesting, we got a caller.
All righty.
Hey, good.
Well, hello. You've called Freethought Forum TV. Can we get a name or a nickname, please?
Yes, it's Charles from Central Illinois.
Hello, Charles.
Go.
And I didn't get to a computer, so I don't know what your show is today.
We're
All
good.
righty. Well, the subject is the Apostle Paul and forgiveness. And Joe is here. Joe used to teach in a university religious department in Texas.
Yeah, we had the philosophy and religion we put together as two departments.
So I'm acting as his student today. If you help me act as his student, that'll be great, Charles.
Okay, the question for Joe is the concept of that with God's sacred grace upon you, that the law actually doesn't have to apply to you?
I didn't quite get the question.
Yeah, the part of your first sentence was a little garbled there, Charles.
Just say it
Ask
again, would you?
Okay. It's the concept that when you have God's sacred grace upon you, elements within the law no longer apply to you. You don't have to follow Judaic law.
Okay, what we're trying to do is take an anthropologist's point of view. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, if you think of, translate the word God temporarily now to mean the community. Okay? Now, the community is before you. That is, before you as an individual. And
Yes.
the community has laws and has regulations and guidelines. And I think this is what is going on in the Apostle Paul's life, is the Hebrew tradition had its community with its laws and regulations. Then he's trying to deal with the Gentiles, the Greeks and the Romans, with their culture. And so he's trying to develop rules and regulations and guidelines that are transcultural. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So,
The opposing team, as it were, the Ebionites, I believe they were referred to, wanted everybody to be within the social-cultural mix of the Jewish community. And Paul was trying to develop a way of inclusiveness that was beginning to contrast significantly.
With some of the Hebrews of his time, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and see, there were other Hebrews who were doing somewhat what Paul was doing. A lot of the rabbis were already questioning the notion of animal sacrifice. And understandably, if you have a community that's not made up of rich people, that's a heavy financial burden. And
not just financial. It could, if a drought happens, it can cause significant hardship.
Exactly. So they developed the notion there might be forgiveness without animal sacrifice. I think what they were trying to get at is the notion is when you do wrong against the community, somebody pays for it. And that's what these sacrifice notions really symbolize, I think.
All right, and then that leads us into the other word that's part of today's topic, forgiveness.
Forgiveness.
What you're trying to say is that Paul is arguing that Christianity now develops a new way to forgive, so you don't have to pay this expensive sacrifice.
Yeah, I think he's saying, and he's coming from that Hebrew tradition. They're already saying this in the prophets. I mean, Micah says the deity isn't interested in sacrifices. He's interested in justice and mercy and humility.
And people that were living the righteous life.
Exactly. Now, Paul is worrying partly about if you got too many rules and regulations that don't seem to be righteous, that puts a burden on people. And he's trying to reform. This is a reform movement. And all cultures do this to survive.
All right, so I need to ask both of you. So here I come from my perspective as a lifelong non-believer. And when I hear the word righteous used, I just associate that with, let's call them theocratic bullies who they believe they've got the special word and they want to impose it on me. Meaning it's not just for how they're going to act themselves, but they want it to be law and applied to me.
Okay.
So there's an imposition aspect of that.
All cultures have to do some kind of,
that being righteous entitles them to
special privileges, special authority.
Special authority over me.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now let me be defensive on this. All cultures have to have some way of dealing with this so that you don't just say, well, I'm a law and you're a law and he's a law and everybody's on his own law. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Now, if we can get all of us in agreement, then we say, well, then we'll call that right. And that's where the word righteous comes from. Those people who are living by that, they call righteous. That doesn't mean self-righteous. It doesn't have to be.
So I guess I get the impression that some people who think that they are living the righteous life is because they are following the true intent as they perceive it of their deity.
Well, that sometimes you do find that, yes.
And that because they have the true intent of the deity, that they should be empowered to write the laws that even apply to me.
In fact, I didn't get to bring it, but I read a Baptist journal recently. It was severely critical of Billy Graham's theocracy. He was saying Billy Graham was going around the country trying to establish God's law. And then that comes through Billy Graham. And these Baptists are saying, no, this is not what the Constitution is about, and it's not what a civilized life is about.
So the writer of this article in this Baptist journal would still be a church-state separationist kind of Baptist.
Church-state, very strongly about that, yeah.
And that was one of the great fears that they had during the Continental Congress back in 1791.
Yeah.
When they formulated the ideas for the Constitution.
Exactly.
And the Baptists, who would later split off into the Baptist and Southern Baptist and so forth, were afraid that since they weren't the dominant number of people, that people would do that to them.
In New England, they hanged, I've forgotten, I think it was 5 Baptists, I'd have to look it up again, but they hanged Baptists in New England because they were That was the Puritan tradition. That's a different tradition.
And the Catholics in Maryland had persecuted Baptists and Puritans and Quakers and everybody else.
So
when they got together in 1791, they realized if this goes on, we're going to have something like the 30 Years' War among ourselves.
that's what they're exactly. Now,
everybody gets to live within the boundaries that they set, and they don't get to impose those boundaries on anybody else.
Now, where do those boundaries, Charles? Where do those boundaries come from?
They all have different interpretations of what the Bible's meaning says.
Well, deeper than that, before the Bible, where'd they come from?
Oh, they're much, much older than the Bible, of course. They came from us.
Yeah.
From our fears or ability to empathize and so forth.
Even animals have rules and regulations, like wolves. Wolves have a rule against killing other wolves.
Yeah, they develop a social structure, and people and members fit into that structure, and the behaviors get expected of them.
Yeah.
That's the big problem they're having in Tennessee and Mississippi. No, not Tennessee. North, South Carolina and Tennessee is that they're demanding that other people have special rights that allow them to deny other people certain things.
Yeah, they're
deeply held religious beliefs.
The association or the special privilege to be mean to your neighbor on religious ground is something that they're trying to promote. Well, Charles, if you weren't listening to the beginning of our show, we did remark on something that we thought of as a kind of a favorable development, and that is that the bill to make the Holy Bible the Tennessee state book, although passed by the legislature, was vetoed by the governor. He vetoed it.
Yes.
And
that would be a direct violation of the separation of church and state.
Yeah, he knows that.
Yeah. And he cited that.
Also, for, I don't know if you know it or not, but the proposed legislation mimicking the Mississippi and South Carolina Religious Freedom Act has been put on the back burner while, quote, we study the situation, unquote.
Yes. So, you know, the social discussion, the discussion in the public sphere, I think they perceived as going against them.
Okay.
And
well, let's get back to our topic now, because we promised our audience.
So, Charles, we encourage you to go fire up your computer and log in and hear the rest of the show. And can we thank you for giving us a call?
When you're about 15 miles from your computer.
Okay, well, thanks for calling in, Charles.
All righty.
Now, on the Apostle Paul, we've got to
go.
emphasize that here's a man in the first century dealing with what has been going on for centuries after that. The cultures cross with each other. They bring their own traditions, and they have to find a new way to get along, and without killing each other off, how to survive, and eventually sometimes even intermarry.
Yep. That was something that was a big problem in the Old Testament when
and we're finding it in this country. For example, when if Muslims want to come in, then there are different kinds of Muslims. See, and so we can't treat all Muslims as simply the ones that are murderous. You see, there many Muslims are peace loving, and they're fearful of these other Muslims.
Yes, I was going to say they are more likely to be victims of the violent Islamists, because they have proximity.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we have to develop guidelines for all of us so we can live together in peace.
Alrighty.
And that's what the Apostle Paul, it seems to be doing.
Well, John, looking at the clock, and we've hit the mid part of the show, so why don't we do our mid-program break? That'll also let us collect our thoughts and get back on target.
Okay.
So, in case you're just tuning in, this is Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. Freethought Forum is funded jointly by them and by individual contributions.
Okay, and we're Tuesday from 5 to 6 p.m., and in Eastern East Tennessee primarily, Channel 12 and Channel 194.
194, I guess.
And you can get local cable network. And tell your out-of-town guests you can get this on streaming as CTV Knox, KNOX.org.
Today's show is live. It is April 19th, I believe, 2016, and you can call in on the number on your screen to speak with us. And while we take a short break, please watch this informative video about the show's sponsors.
If you live in or around the Knoxville area and are questioning your religious beliefs or simply believe in one less God than everyone else, well, you're not alone. The Atheist Society of Knoxville is a fun and friendly group of people just like you that meets twice a week at a bar or restaurant. We meet every Tuesday night following the show at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria for happy hour. You'll find our group either inside or on the patio. Look for Richard Dawkins' silver-jacketed book, The God Delusion, standing upright on the table. On Fridays, we meet at Agave Azul or the Beard and Beer Market. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't. We all question what we believe at one point in our lives. If this is the time for you, come join us for food, drink, conversation, and fun. Do you find stories of talking snakes laughable? Do you prefer the scientific method over supernatural beliefs? Are you concerned about religious leaders and organizations imposing their values and rules on your body, your family, and the rest of our society? Well, take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. The Rationalists of East Tennessee meets weekly for fellowship and provides a forum for people who support skeptical thinking and rational discussion of these and other issues. To find out more information or to find out about our next meeting, visit us on the web at www.rationalist.org.
Okay, and we're back. The Atheist Society of Knoxville, or ASK, meets one or two times a week. We have evening meetups for food, fun, drink, and conversation. ASK's purpose is to supply a venue for community camaraderie and outreach to atheists, agnostics, freethinkers, and other like-minded people in the East Tennessee area. Our Tuesday meeting is ongoing right now at Barley's Tap Room and Pizzeria in the Old City. And, you know, like other things recently, some of it, well, I guess it was around the holiday. Some of us went and saw the Star Wars movie. So there's fun things to do like that. Can you tell us about the Rationalist activities?
The second Sunday of most months is the Rationalists of East Tennessee in the Skeptics Book Club. The title of the next book is this: Devil's Game, How the United States Helped Unleash Fundamentalist Islam. That'll be interesting to...
Yes.
Sunday, that's May 8 at 2 p.m. The public is invited. It's Sunday, May 8, 2 p.m. The public, you need not have read the book, but that would help. And where's it going to be?
It's at Books A Million at 8513 Kingston Pike, right here in Knoxville. So let's see. Also coming up on May the 15th is the annual RET guest speaker, featuring this year Jerry DeWitt, author of Hope After Faith. Jerry is the first graduate of the Clergy Project. He is a former minister who has left faith and moved on. I'm told he is quite an entertaining speaker because he can still throw the switch and be back in to Southern preacher mode, but he can do so fully for Freethought.
Okay.
So I'm looking forward to that. That's on May the 15th, and I think that's a Sunday as well, so it probably replaces our regular morning program.
Probably, yeah.
Visit the rationalist.org website for details, and don't trust my memory.
Okay.
Speaking of not trusting my memory, Joe, what were we talking about?
We were going to talk about sacrifice.
All right, as well as, so we were talking, you mentioned several times this anthropological approach to understanding what Paul is doing in his environment. And I guess you can contrast to what other kind of approach? A missionary approach?
Well,
what would that mean?
Well, a missionary approach as a goal is to say, you people have not heard the gospel, or whatever it is
the
you're
good word,
carrying.
or the new product.
And we wanted, and a more moderate approach would be, we've got the good news, we want to share it. You
Right.
see? Okay. And educators do this somewhat. You
Well,
see. But
we remind viewers that we do that here. We think we've got what one of our members refers to as the better news. There is no
Well, all
eternal
cultures-
punishment and so on.
in other words, your neighbor may have something that you don't have, and if he wants to share it, it doesn't cost too much.
Yeah.
Then that's good. That's being a good neighbor. And so a missionary approach, now if they have to go to another country and tell them that they not only need this gospel, but if they don't, then the hell, you're going to be in hell, then that's different from an anthropologist's approach.
It's
An anthropologist is trying to learn mostly from the other culture rather than bring in another culture. That's a different.
All right, I got your point now. All right. I was going to say, well, there's a carrot and stick here, but you're saying the anthropologist is actually trying to figure out what will be the carrot to these new people.
Because the anthropologist is assuming that another culture will have ways of trying to solve their problems. So then when you get back and you share it with another culture, you might be able to learn from each other. And some of it's just to learn for learning's sake, and the other has a practical think, well, if they are solving it this way, maybe we could learn a little bit from them and see how it works.
So can you think of examples of things that Paul advocated adopting from Greek and Roman culture?
Well, the early Christians, I think, borrowed a lot of the Greek stories about their gods
All right.
and reworked it into their value system.
Can you be specific? All right, you were about to. I didn't mean
Okay,
to
you had
prompt
both the Greeks and the Romans and the Hebrews having versions of sacrifices.
All right.
Now, this is the way I interpret Paul. I don't think Paul would put it this way, because let me put it Paul's way. He thought, a vision,
All right.
a supernatural vision. And it's an interpretation of the fact that a Jew named Jesus, Yeshua, was executed like a criminal.
Uh-huh.
Now, I think Paul is in his own mind, and I don't think he got revelation. This is my view. But he did. But another interpretation is he was doing hard thinking. Are we going to perpetuate these sacrifices forever? Mm-hmm. That's a lot of killing. That's a lot of meat. Mm-hmm. And I think what he was doing was saying that one Jew who was loved and good was executed by the Roman government. And that turned out to be, they didn't know what was going on, but that turned out to be the final and last and supreme sacrifice. After that, we don't need any more blood sacrifices.
And so, although we mentioned on other shows, for the benefit of new viewers, that has also the effect of unempowering the Jewish priests at the time.
Any kind of priesthood, it should, yes.
So it is actually an attack on the economic system that he wishes to replace.
Yes, because it was considered to be somewhat of a racket. I mean, who's in charge of the animals and who gets the meat? And then these farmers, can they afford to bring all these animals in unless they get a good payment on it?
Yeah.
And then maybe they need to be doing other kind of crops. And so...
And obviously, if you're in Athens or in Rome, and you're told that proper sacrifice has to be taken to a temple
and it's in Jerusalem.
That's not practical.
Well, and that's why Paul, who, after all, did a lot of travel, begun to realize this. And that's why the Jews developed then very shrewdly synagogues. Synagoge, this means gathering together, the assemblies. And that became mostly the center of the Jewish world, all around the Mediterranean there.
Well, and then there was also actually the destruction of the Jewish temple in
70
like
A.D., yeah.
70 or 78?
70.
Okay,
Yeah.
70.
Yeah, and that was a big factor in revising Judaism and Christianity.
It would obviously be a challenge to maintaining the ideas that that there was a Jewish king always on the throne when the temple has been destroyed and the people have been forcibly dispersed.
Yeah, and
So
the Jewish king,
that makes it ripe for having to say, okay, we've got to reinterpret this in light of new events.
and even before then, the Greeks and the Romans had moved in and done away with, for all practical purposes, a strong Hebrew king. That's why they kept referring to David. And because that was when at the peak of the power.
Well, meaning that they refer to a King David as the idea of when the kingdom of Israel was at its height of power.
Yeah.
And
David and Solomon. Those were the two big. And Solomon was right after David. Now the big thing I think Paul is saying is that if you take this one death of Joshua or Jesus and make that the final sacrifice, then we don't have to worry about these animal sacrifices anymore. In other words, apply this. Now there is some tradition for this already. You had about 800 Jews that were murdered about 150 years beforehand, and many Jews tended to look upon those as a kind of extra, that you got extra advantages through their death. Now, in other words, you have this.
Heard about this.
You have this in wartime. So and so died, and that helped give you freedom. Now, if you think of a death of these people, they give you some advantages in a war. They made the supreme sacrifice. You see the word sacrifice.
All right, yes.
And so what Paul is saying, here's one now, building on this tradition, who is the divine Savior.
Okay.
You see, that means you don't need this anymore. This is the final sacrifice.
By emphasizing that it was a divine sacrifice.
Yeah. Now, what some of the early Hebrews had done before Paul was begun to count prayer as a substitute for sacrifice. See, they were trying to work. See, what I'm trying to say, an anthropologist would say, here's what's going on. They're working through their problems, trying to make it more workable, because the one that was workable created too many problems. So now if they can solve both the problems, they can move on.
Well, and the fundamental thing is that if you're supposed to go and tell the whole world about this good news, and most of the world is not genetically Hebrew, that is an opportunity to say, okay, those rules only applied to the Hebrew, those of Hebrew descent, and that we have, it acts as an excuse to relax the dietary restrictions. And
exactly. In fact,
and that then, so it brings to end this animal sacrifice, which attacks the economic power of the priest system such as it was, and substitutes, as you say, you're saying prayer.
Yeah, prayer.
Right.
In other words, the synagogues had already, since you don't have the sacrifices in the synagogues around different parts of the world.
So do you think that Paul's letters were written before or after the destruction of the temple?
They were written before, just barely before. Some maybe came later. Now, what's called the pastoral epistles are in his name, and they're after the destruction. But most scholars think, no, they're just written in his name by somebody else who tries to think like Paul.
There's a beautiful word, pseudoepigraphia. Which is a polite way to say that it's fraudulently attributed.
It's a fraudulently, yeah. Now, from their point of view, they thought they were writing, quote, in the spirit of Paul.
Yeah.
But it is fraudulent if you pass it off as Paul's.
Yeah. And which books are thought to be pseudo-epigraphia?
Well, that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus.
Okay.
Those are called the pastoral epistles.
All right.
And but the others are thought to mostly, well, maybe 2nd Thessalonians. I mean, there's some debate on that. But you've got Galatians and Romans and Corinthians, clearly.
At the time I read the
Paul.
Bible, I didn't know about all these assertions, and therefore I didn't know to look for stylistic differences or differences in what they may have known and claimed. And I read this book about who wrote the Bible, and they're referring to the Old Testament that introduced me to the idea of the documentary hypothesis. And it's caused me to go back and reread at least portions of the Old Testament again.
Oh, yeah.
With that insight. And then you can say, yes, I can now sort of feel the confluence of ideas that the documentary hypothesis brings to it, that the Northern Kingdom and the Southern Kingdom had to recombine their traditions.
Exactly. There's another example. If you got two somewhat similar cultures, but they had enough difference they had to learn.
Yeah, they had diverged while the kingdoms were separate, and then after the Northern Kingdom was destroyed and refugees made it to Judea, they had to reassimilate. So then in Paul's times, it's sort of like now the Hebrew culture has got to be modified to adapt to the new environment it's trying to grow into.
Yeah, and you can see the rabbis. In fact, Hiram Maccoby, who's a rabbi today, has a book called The Myth Maker. And he's dealing with the Apostle Paul from a Hebrew tradition, a current Hebrew tradition. And I'm borrowing partly from him, partly from others, trying to say, well, this is what anthropologists and sociologists would call the convergence of multiple cultures, and trying to solve the problems so they can live together peacefully. And you find this was already happening among the Hebrews before Paul. The synagogues, you see, have what to call the Gentiles. They call them the God-fearers, but that was just a way of saying they're part of the monotheistic tradition, but they don't go through all. Now, one of the big problems in Galatians is if these Gentiles come in, do they have to be circumcised? And Paul is saying no. And he then refers to Abraham, who was before Moses.
All right.
And Abraham's faith he takes as the model before Moses, you see.
All right.
And that's a crucial, in other words, what he's doing is he's drawing on the Hebrew tradition and saying, now, let's go back before Moses and get to Abraham's faith before you had all these regulations.
All right. So that's, in a sense, you're saying he's trying to make the case that loving Yahweh was the important characteristic, that it wasn't the sacrifice Abraham made, but it was the willingness to do.
As a matter of fact, you got the story of in the Hebrew Bible itself of Abraham wants to sacrifice his son.
Didn't want to, but was prepared to.
Well, he took him up there and raised the knife.
But he was prepared to under instruction of the deity.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then you have, I think the story was written to say, let's get rid of this notion of child sacrifice and put it in the story of Abraham. It was written after Abraham, in my opinion. But what I'm trying to show is that Abraham was one of those major figures that you referred to.
Okay.
And Paul simply picked up on that.
Because he was trying to obsolete something about the Moses laws because they were so hard to get Gentiles to buy into.
Yeah,
so he thus has to make them seem...
Exactly.
To sort of argue that, well, they only applied to the Hebrews.
Small group in particular. They were ethnocentric.
Ethnocentric. Okay. Well, man, we've got only about 5 minutes. Haven't seen any phone calls. Viewers, if you got something quick, you got a minute or two to call in. Okay. Are there any points we haven't covered that you wanted to touch on?
Is sometimes people have said Paul was opposed to the law, the Torah. Actually, he wasn't. What he's trying to do is refine it. And if you look in Galatians, the 5th chapter, about verse 14 through 23, you find that he's got laws, mostly that come from the Ten Commandments and some others. But in other words, he's simply...
When you say laws in particular, there's the admonition to love your neighbors.
Yeah, and he's spelling it out in detail.
And that, that's somewhere in one of the Gospels that Jesus says, I give you this new commandment, and that is to love your neighbor.
As yourself.
As yourself.
And the Gospels were written after Paul. And some scholars...
So would they have gotten that idea from Paul's point in Galatians?
I think you could make a good case that Paul understood some of what he's talking about, love your neighbor, is in the Hebrew Bible, and you pass it on.
The phone is ringing.
Good.
We can do this. Hello, caller. Give us a name or nickname real quick. We'll only have a minute or two, so let's move quickly.
Kid.
Go.
Okay, Kid. Please give us a comment or a question quickly.
Well, I can't speak well. I've had a stroke. And
Sure.
I just want to thank you and the staff for your work and hard work. It's very important for this view to be represented and increase our acceptance in the community. And since people weren't calling in, I wanted to tell you that I'm grateful, and please don't stop.
Okay, well,
Thank you for calling in and sharing that with us, even though I guess you say it's difficult. We'll be here most Tuesdays, and we try and talk on a variety of subjects, and if you can make it down to Barley's, we can talk there as well.
Thank you very much.
You take good care of yourself now.
All righty.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye, then. All righty.
So Paul's, the reason he's interested in forgiveness is every culture, Jew, Greek, Roman, whatever, American, we've all got to have some way to start over again. If we make mistakes, we do wrong.
All right.
We try not to, but when we do, we like to be able to say, it's not going to be held against us forever and ever.
All right.
And then Paul is trying to say the rules are terribly important, and the forgiveness is equally important.
So where did Paul come down on with eternal punishment in hell?
That's interesting.
Address that?
He inherited this view, and this is why he's so.
We've only got half a minute, too.
Okay,
and it's
well,
such an interesting question.
Yeah, it is too interesting for just this, but
So-
he's trying to get a way out of it.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, and then he's doing it much better than he thinks his tradition has done, or any other tradition, and that's why he's trying to rework this new system.
All righty. I see by the clock that we've hit the minute mark, so let's begin our closing. It's time to start wrapping things out, viewers. Get your pen and paper. This has been Freethought Forum, a program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Faithless Forrest.
And I'm Joe Barnhart, and you can see the show on Tuesdays, 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time, Knoxville station CTVKNOX.org.
The opinions expressed on this show are of the hosts and, if we had any guests and callers, not any official opinion of RET or ASK. We'd like to thank Sam for technical support and the staff at CTV KNOX and our viewers and our callers.
And we want to remind you that we are the Rationalists of East Tennessee and the Atheist Society of Knoxville, and we welcome your feedback. Hope you'll be with us.